Welcome everyone. Today I'm going to be presenting an excerpt from my lecture on Hölderlin, which is part of my course on German Idealism. So for this particular course I've written lectures on Kant, Fichte, Hölderlin, Schelling and Hegel, and the lecture on Hölderlin focuses on the harmony of opposites, the poetical I as opposed to the philosophical I or ego, and also on his poem Die Musa, or leisure, as it would be translated in English, even if not very satisfactorily so. And in this poem really we find Hölderlin's appreciation for nature and man's place within it. So I'm going to read from this part of my lecture. If you'd like to study this course at length, the entire course on Kant and Fichte and Schelling and Hölderlin and the others, you can just follow the link in the description of this video and you can enroll on our platform on Teachable there. So Hölderlin's poem Die Musa from 1797 says from out of the realm of Musa itself. It speaks from this realm. The word Musa is usually translated as leisure, which means the license laborers have from time to take some time off from work. Yet Musa means something else. Take Joseph Pieper's essay Musa und Kult. This is usually translated as leisure, the basis of civilization. How could leisure, that is to say the licensed allotted time frame free from productive work for the sake of capital maximization, be the basis of civilization? Something significant is lost with the word leisure. This spans open the ordinary needs, work, leisure dialectic, which is a fake dialectic, which forbids any deeper thought after or within and from within the realm of Musa. The German word Musa does have to do with time, but more precisely, Musa denotes the time of a space in which a free relationality establishes itself for a moment. We will think of Musa here as realm, a time space in which the harmonically contrapositioned unity occurs. We will think of Musa also as related to the Greek word scolaire. Scolaire indeed is the basis, the very foundation of the Occident. Scolaire comes from the verb echein, which means to have, to hold. Echein, this verb, can also mean to be and to be able to. Plato speaks of scolaire in his dialogue on Critias. There it is in the moment of a sudden seeing, ideton, that a sudden seeing that all of a sudden what is necessary, the necessary needs and things the human being requires is already provided for. What we really need is already provided for. It is the moment when scolaire arrives in the midst of Athens, and that's when Athens is founded as Athens. It is the moment when the realm, the time of the space for mythologia and for the cherishing of their ancestors opens itself up. So you can read this in the Critias dialogue by Plato on Athens. Thus, scolaire means finding and upholding a stance in the midst of what is so that what is required for inhabiting, inscaping into nature. Hölderlin's, so inhabiting is a beautiful English word. To inhabit, to be in the habit of being in and within, in nature. So Hölderlin's poem Die Musa tells of this realm of scolaire. The word Musa is not mentioned in the poem itself, it's only the title. The poem does not tell us about labor relations or free time from work which can be utilized for the sake of relaxation. For example, getting fit again to be more productive the next day through physical exercise or mental gymnastics or an app that you can use to meditate. Well, the poem speaks of, more strictly, out of a very different realm, a completely different realm entirely. In fact, the title Die Musa is not just a title, which is to give some indication what the poem is about, as if any poem was simply about some issue or another. Instead, the title itself already, if only inceptually, spans open the realm out of that which is to be spoken. Scolaire as the meeting place of man and nature. The poem begins as follows, German: Sorglos schlummert die Brust und es ruhen die strengen Gedanken. Free from worry the chest slumbers, and still lie the strict thoughts. Note the period after strict thoughts. So there's a period, a full stop. This invites us to think. Free from worries, the strict thoughts remain calm. Still, this poem thinks, and it does think poetically. What are those strict thoughts? Those are the thoughts of formal logic. The pre-formatted thoughts, for example, of the principle of non-contradiction, which lets reason run into antinomies. The thought schemata and templates which are commonly mistaken for thinking and which are attributed to an allegedly already finished logic, which stands ready for all times as a toolbox for the technical operations of corroborating what is correct. Such templates of thought shadows are here at rest. They find no place at all, to be precise, for they impede what is at stake, the thinking of free play, of what is contrapositioned coming together. The chest, as the seat of the heart, is without worry, which is what allows for the strict thoughts to remain quiet. In fact, strict thoughts ordinarily are what pretend to give a false peace of mind, insofar as they try to soothe the searching mind, looking for something to hold on to, which the mind finds in the unquestioned laws and principles of thought, whose presuppositions no one any longer questions. These thought templates here have no place, and still the chest is without worry, prepared to let itself into the thinking of the free play. The period of full stop right at the end of the first verse excludes the thought templates. In Scolaire, in the realm of Musa, thanks to its realm, another way of thinking is required. A thinking which cannot find an easy peace in first principles, but a thinking which must let itself into and articulate the free coming about of harmonious contrapositions. Through their being suspended, the strict thoughts are excluded from the motion of the poem. What begins to spring and show itself is the all of nature, das All der Natur, which springs from the all-unifying one. The human being and his activities or interests during times of work and times of leisure are not mentioned at all. The poem rather enters the realm of Scolaire, wherein man and world, animal and the whole of nature and spirit arise. Thus the poem continues after the first line: out onto the meadows I stroll, where the grass from the root freshly, like the wellspring, sprouts for me, where the lovely lip of the flower opens itself for me and breathes upon me with fresh autumn. As soon as the strict thought templates are excluded and the transcendental eye translates into the poetic eye, which can stroll outside itself and into nature without having to try and subdue her in all her mighty selfhood in free individuality. For it is only here, in harmonious contraposition with nature, and thus the possibility of unification, that true harmony arises. The flamelet of life appears here to the poetical eye as well. The ever-living fire of Heraclitus, which in its concealed ways lets us into the orbits of the cosmos. Fire, of course, is not some representable force which acts on or through life. In the poetic thinking way, fire is not a fanciful force. Instead, fire is what gives from out of itself, what grants, what arises and bursts, holding itself, warming, what consumes itself as it burns and gives and can take, what brings danger also, and thus holds within itself also the highest moments of saving grace. In the midst of their joy, of animals and their ways, in the midst of the sweet games of life, underneath the clouds surrounding the mountains, clouds which are reflected in the valleys, in the midst of these regions, the human being strolls. Yet it is not the poetical eye that sees the whole of nature or the cosmos of nature. The poetical eye here transforms itself into an eagle. Da werd ich zum Adler. There I become an eagle. In looking away from the human being, we begin to see the whole. We begin to see that the categories of the chain of being are not derived solely from the eagle. Here, in looking away from the human being, the whole appears, the one that is one and all, the one that unfolds as one and all. This one is not identical with Scolaire, yet in Scolaire, in her realm, is where this one begins to appear. Only from the view, from on the orbit of the eagle, a path discloses itself, quote, the path back to the life of human beings. That is to say, the human being, his realm and his ways come into view only through going outside and beyond the human being returning to him. Any understanding of what it means to be a human being arises through moving away and looking away. And from this moving away, looking back to the human, but through the eyes from the orbit of nature herself. The city, which is described as a well-maintained polis, safeguarded against the guard of tempests, but also against human enemies. This city lights up to the poetical eye, returning to the ways of men in the glowing light of the evening. The majestic armor of the polis protects the peace, yet at the same time the armor also indicates the threat of war and the dangers of nature in the midst, and of man of course, in the midst of which the human being is and must necessarily also be, and thanks to which the human being can at all be. The majestic element of the city, its armor against tempests and war, here appears in the twilight of the evening. For it is during this hour of fading light that the immeasurable of the world shines forth. Only through striving together with, but also against the sturdy and indomitable of the world, can the polis assert itself, yet not through the attempt to turn the night into day or by crudely attempting to control for all the potential dangers technologically by means of a steadily increasing and therefore grueling excessive force of a blind will to will. Even this self-assertion of the polis still occurs within the realm of Scolaire, the self-assertion I mean here, in Hölderlin's poem. And it happens and it takes place according to the law of Musa, of Scolaire, because there is in it a place for a measure of sufficiency, of what is needed and what is not, of what is appropriate to the city and its surroundings, its villages, and what is not. This measure of sufficiency is Scolaire as the basis for the well-ordered polis. And through the upholding of this measure, the polis is embedded in and stretching out into its region. Autarky is always just a logical display behavior, said Bruno Liebhochs, a German philosopher. That is to say, the one who wants to be fully autonomous, purely for himself, is an idiot, as the Greeks called him, the idiotes. The Greek city, the Greek polis, is therefore, and also the polis here in the poem, is therefore not just for itself trying to be autark. Instead, the poem, the Musa, tells of the polis as surrounded by villages and fields, by homely smoke from chimneys. The city, as well as the villages and the fields, all are only insofar as they are in the neighborhood of each other. Only here, when the villages are mentioned and how they chatter out through the twilight, is human labor referred to just once. The plough slumbers on separate fields, and the fenced gardens rest. Note how Hölderlin speaks not of the resting of the human being, but of the resting of the different regions where produce is grown and harvested, and of the resting of equipment and tools. For it is not the human subject that purely on its own emanates the categories with which nature is ordered. Instead, the human being and the tools produced by humans for the regions in which they are used are all of one and the same, unfolding and folding back from what is and what is not. Here, Hölderlin also tries to think through the difference between labor and rest, but insofar as they belong together. Laboring on the fields and in the fenced gardens, of course there's a difference between labor and rest, but there can be a restful labor, and there can be a labor that is in a good way tiring, not exhausting, but making one in a healthy way tired, to sleep and rest at night, to rise again the next day, to plow the fields, not to function as such in a machine, but to be in and with those deeper relations which bind us and which grant meaning. Laboring on the fields and in the fenced gardens, where food for cattle and humans are grown, and hence where the fate of the city is also determined. This laboring, however, is not coined by Unrest. To be more precise, this laboring is not determined by an externally caused hecticness. The resting of the plough during the night does not stand in opposition to an external unrest of the day, for it is the plough that rests. Labor and ease, activity and rest, as well as retreat, day and night remain differentiated, distinct, yet they belong together out of that difference, which is here thought specifically and poetically, as well as that difference which must necessarily be upheld, the difference between mortal men and the gods, in the gestalt of the god of tempest and the god to wit, which can at any time suddenly erupt and withdraw what the city requires for its existence. It is in the calm of nights, in the shimmering light of the moon, that something else begins to show itself, as residing in the chest or bosom of the earth, but also in man, something that in both rages and festers, the secret spirit of unrest. Suddenly we see broken pillars of temples from the days of old, temples which no longer serve any gods as sight, but whose withdrawal still echoes through the eons. The spirit of unrest once destroyed those temples. This spirit is secret and concealed. It is festering in both the earth, that is to say in the concealed concealing, and in the human being, that is to say the mortal being that ceaselessly attempts to overreach in search of power. The mortal being that is never fully transparent to himself and close also to his inner abyss. This spirit of unrest is the truly unconquered, the old conqueror, as Hölderlin calls him, quote, the frightening one, the terrifying one. The Greeks called the frightening todenon, from which there can be no escape. The frightening or terrifying will eventuate inevitably and will suddenly come over the human being as long as the human being is, for that spirit is also always festering in the human and in the earth. For the earth is on the one hand that which nurtures and carries, but on the other hand the earth is also always the danger of the most radical withdrawal. Man and earth are connected to each other through the spirit of unrest. Each community of fate formed by the mortals is most deeply related to the earth and her mysterious bearing. The spirit of unrest cannot be subdued, cannot be eradicated, for this spirit is born from one womb, aus einem Schoße geboren, together with the spirit of rest, dem Geist Der Ruhe. This one. The one, das eine Eins, the all-unifying one, of which speaks also the Henkaipan, of which Heraclitus says, striving and coming together, bursting apart, harmonizing, disharmonizing, and out of all one, and out of one all. End of quote from Heraclitus, fragment 10. This is the thought poetically here articulated in a poem on scolaire, on leisure. For it is in the question after scolaire that something else is at stake than the ordinary work, leisure, dialectics. That's so benign. And how this contradiction could be solved technologically and technocratically, etc., 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 by automation, etc., etc. All this nonsense. No, something else entirely is at stake than the superficial work, leisure, dialectic. I'll say it again, something more profound and crucial. The place of the human being where the human being can be human. Hence the question for scolaire is always also connected to the question of the being, of the human being, and his dignity. Hölderlin's poem asks us to think the all-unifying one without falling for a superficial dialectics. What gives us to think? What is there to think? The equiprimordial ground and off-ground of the earth as the home site or homestead of the human being who, in the midst of beings, must find a stance and a hold without becoming a destroyer, so that, as Hölderlin poetizes in the Rhine, the fates are in balance for a while. Thank you very much indeed. And just to mention this again, if you'd like to study German Idealism more closely with me, then please feel free to register for my course on German Idealism. Thank you very much indeed.